Academy today for the third meeting within the framework of the Seminars on Poland project, which is an effect of collaboration between the Polish Foreign Ministry and the Institute de Republika. And I'd like to greet the director of the Institute, Professor Andrzej Przyłębski, who is here with us today. Hello, Mr. Director. Today's lecture is unique because our guest came straight from London to be here with us today. And Professor Roger Moorhouse is a British historian and author specializing in the history of Third Reich Poland in the World War II. And his important books help to understand Polish history and Poland better globally, and we are grateful for that. And also I'd like to mention that in October 2022, Mr. Moorhouse received an award from the Polish Foreign Ministry for the best foreign language publication about Polish history. It was the First to Fight, the Polish War 1939. Great book, I highly recommend you to read it. And today's lecture will be about the Lados Group and the role of Polish diplomats in saving Jews during the Second World War. It is also connected with a publication that is going out soon. The title, The Forgers, the Forgotten Story of the Holocaust Most Audacious Rescue Operation. So I will just stop here and give the floor to our guest, Professor Moorhouse. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your kind invitation and for all being here today. It's a great pleasure to be here. Before I start, just a very brief act of shameless self-promotion. I thought I'd start with the two covers. This is the UK and the US covers of The Forgers, the book on the Lados Group, which is coming out later this year. The UK edition with the yellow lettering is coming out in August, and the US one on the right is due out in October. There is a Polish edition in the pipeline coming out with the Znak in 2024, next year. Forgive the delay. That's publishers for you. The UK and US were quicker off the mark. So those are in the pipeline, and as I was just saying to the director, I think it's a tremendous opportunity to sort of spread the word of the Lados Group, in a sense beyond Polish-speaking circles. Now the story is relatively well known now in Poland already, and this is a chance to, crucially, I think, spread the word beyond Polish-speaking circles. Having done that bit of shameless self-promotion, I should give a word of thanks to certainly two individuals, one of whom is Dr. Jakub Kumoch, who was the former ambassador to Switzerland, who did so much to bring the story of the Lados Group to wider attention through his own research and through a really dogged attempt to find out the truth of the story and to bring it to a wider public. And alongside him, I should also thank Jędrzej Uszyński, who is here. There he is, at the back. Who did a lot of that sort of archival digging, without which, and without Jakub Kumoch and without Jędrzej's work, there would be no book, and I wouldn't be standing here. So, thank you. On the 13th of October, 1943, the Polish ambassador to Switzerland, Alexander Ładoś, was summoned to an interview with the Swiss Foreign Minister Marcel Pilet-Golage. More than anyone else, perhaps, Pilet-Golage had been responsible for charting Switzerland's neutral course during World War II, between the threats of its northern totalitarian neighbour and the promises of the Western Allies. Switzerland's unenviable position in Europe after the fall of France in 1940, as an island of democracy in a totalitarian sea, was guarded by a strange combination of fawning servility and blustering self-confidence. While the Swiss military trained and retrained loudly stressing the impenetrability of the country's mountain heart. It also professed an undying willingness of its soldiers to fight to the last man, and at the same time its politicians bent over backwards to accommodate most of the wishes of its totalitarian neighbours. Lauded by some as a pragmatist, Pilet-Golage was damned by others as an appeaser. Indeed, as you can see in that picture, with his lank comb-over and strange, incongruous toothbrush moustache, he was considered by many to be tacking rather too closely to the dictator to the north, whom he so weirdly resembled. For his part, Alexander Ładoś had already experienced those Swiss accommodations at first hand. Aged over 50, prematurely grey, and impressively rotund, Ładoś had been a professional diplomat until his opposition to Pilsudski's coup of 1926 had derailed his career. Thereafter, he worked as a journalist until he was rehabilitated in 1940 by the Sikorski government, then in exile in France, which had nominated him as Polish ambassador to Switzerland, a key appointment for an exile government struggling to maintain contact with the home country. Yet, Ładoś's appointment had aroused the anger of the Germans, and Ribbentrop duly complained to the Swiss that they were unwise to appoint a new ambassador to a country which, to his mind, no longer existed, and he threatened to raise the matter with Hitler. The Swiss, of course, backed down, and a compromise was found by which Ładoś would be free to enjoy all the privileges of an ambassador, but would formally only be given the title of chargé d'affaires ad interim. So it was technically as chargé that Ładoś appeared before Pilet-Golage that morning in 1943. The reason for the meeting was simple. Swiss authorities had been investigating the staff of the Polish embassy, Ładoś's staff, for most of the previous year, for their participation in the illegal production of Latin American passports. Throughout that year, numerous individuals had been brought in for interrogation by the Swiss police. None of them had disavowed the operation. None of them had denied or downplayed their participation. A few of them had even been brought before a court. But the cases had been thrown out as, in the judge's assessment, no Swiss laws had been broken. But for Pilet-Golage and for his colleagues in the Swiss police, the passport operation was embarrassing. Not least as the Germans were now pressuring him to ensure that it was closed down by fair means or foul. And it was to that end, of course, that he had summoned Ładoś. The meeting was not a cordial one. Ładoś began by criticising the investigation into his staff, demanded to know why he had not been consulted earlier, and in answering the foreign minister's suggestion that the passport forgery operation should be halted, he had countered, rather disingenuously, that it was nothing to do with Switzerland, it was solely the concern of the Poles and the Paraguayan government, in whose name most of the passports had been issued. When Pilet-Golage then claimed that such a serious offence as passport forgery demanded an official response, Ładoś had replied, again rather disingenuously, that the passports were not forgeries anyway. They were stamped and signed and issued in the regular manner. Sensing perhaps that the interview was not going his way, Ładoś appealed to the foreign minister's humanitarian side, stating that the operation had been inspired by a very noble intention, that of saving the lives of as many people, as many good people as possible. Pilet-Golage, however, was unmoved, and he failed to respond even to Ładoś's final provocative, nonetheless plausible suggestion that his intransigence was motivated by anti-Semitism. Rising from his chair to signal an end to the meeting, the foreign minister thanked the ambassador for coming and muttered, "Les choses en sont là." There the matter rests. With that, it seemed, the efforts of the Lados Group to save Jews from the Holocaust came to an end. some months later, in January 1944, it was estimated that they had supplied passports to some 10,000 individuals. And it was estimated at that point as well that the vast majority of those individuals were then still alive. So what was the Lados Group? Who were its members? How did the operation work? There we have the 6 core members of the Lados Group. As we know, Alexander Lados, top left, the ambassador, the charge in Switzerland. He was appointed that spring in 1940, had been a diplomat in Riga and elsewhere, and as I said, his career had rather been derailed by Pilsudski's coup of 1926. He was a member of the Stronnictwo Ludowe, so he was a member of the effectively Peasant Party, and had made a living as a journalist after 1926, and then been rehabilitated by the Sikorski government. His other 2 fellow diplomats, Stefan Reniewicz beneath him, and then Konstantin Rokicki, were respectively councillor and vice-consul of the mission. Reniewicz was the deputy head of mission. And they'd both been in post, again, relatively recently, 1938 and 39, respectively, in Bern. Those were the 3 diplomatic members of the group. Juliusz Król, you can see, in the centre at the bottom, was a local member of the local staff. He was also of Polish origin. He had gone to Bern to study economics in 1929 and had lived there ever since. And he was employed as local staff. And on the right side, 2 Jewish members of the group. Obviously, Juliusz Król was also Jewish. 2 Jewish members of the group, Abraham Silberschein and Chaim Eis, who represented, if you like, the sort of Jewish activist element of the group. Abraham Silberschein had been a Polish MP and was a representative of the World Jewish Council and set up a Relico, which was established to assist Jews in need in 1939. So they represented the connection to Jewish organisations worldwide and, importantly, to their funding sources as well, but also to many of the Jewish communities within occupied Poland, particularly Chaim Eis had contacts to many within the Orthodox community. So those are the 6 members of the Lados Group themselves. There were others peripheral to it, but it's estimated that really those were the 6 sort of core members, all of whom knew the sort of the intimate goings on of the forgery operation. So how did it come about? The origins of this operation actually lie peculiarly, not necessarily with the Holocaust, but with the Soviet occupation of Eastern Poland between 1939 and 41. As I'm sure you all know, that occupation, like its German counterpart from 1939, involved a very significant degree of the sifting and sorting of local populations. In the Soviet case, on the basis of class, on the basis of political loyalty and class, whereas in the German case it was on the basis of race. In the process, a lot of Jews were unhappy at becoming Soviet citizens effectively overnight, and at having for the Orthodox among them, having their religious sentiments trumped by the communist system. So for many of them, they sought a way out, which through that first Soviet occupation, 39 to 41, the way out was often down through Romania, but for many of them it was up into Lithuania, which was still nominally independent at that point. That large number of Polish Jews, Polish Jewish refugees, who found their way into Lithuania through 1939-40, of course found themselves from the summer of 1940 onwards in what became Soviet Lithuania. So any Polish documentation that they had with them was suddenly overnight was invalid. They were Soviet citizens overnight, and many of them, again, for the reasons I just mentioned, whether religious or on class basis or just on principle, did not appreciate being members of the Soviet Union, citizens of the Soviet Union. So there began to be a pressure, particularly in that summer of 1940, as things began to hot up with the annexation, effective incorporation of Lithuania into the Soviet Union. Things began to hot up and they increasingly began to seek a way out. The way out they found There's a peculiar route, which is relatively well known, is via what is known as the Sukihara operation. This is a chap called Hyune Sukihara, who was the Japanese consul in Kaunas, in Lithuania. And he, in concert with the Dutch consul, whose name was Jan Swartendijk, they developed a plan for fugitive Jews to escape effectively to Curacao, to the Dutch colony of Curacao. The curious thing is that Curacao actually didn't require a visa, but they were issuing visas for Curacao because it satisfied the Soviet insistence and also the Japanese insistence that you had to have a final destination. So for all of these fugitive Jews, refugee Jews, they had to fulfill the requirements of the bureaucracy, which very often meant you had to have a final destination proven. You couldn't just escape from one country with no clear destination in sight. So what this plan did was it gave them that destination, Curacao, even though that was mythical. Curacao didn't require a visa to enter, but it allowed them to say to the Soviet bureaucracy and then to the Japanese bureaucracy, this is where we're going. So then they could get transit visas for the other places as well. So this scheme was actually developed, some suggest that this scheme was actually developed in concert with two Polish intelligence officers who were working with Sugihara in Kaunas at the time, so there's a Polish connection there. There's also a very strong Polish connection at the other end, so all of these refugees that left from the Sugihara operation went across the Trans-Siberian Railway and then into Japan and supposedly onward from Japan. Many of them actually ended up in Shanghai, in the Jewish colony in Shanghai, and lived out the war there. But at the other end, they are effectively met at the time by Tadeusz Romer, who was then the Polish ambassador in Tokyo. And he was very active in creating the networks and support networks for those people arriving in Japan at the time. He, of course, was later foreign minister of the government exile in London. So through those connections, through the intelligence connection to Sugihara directly and through Tadeusz Romer at the other end, London and Bern would have known very well that this was going on. This was an option. And the link here is through this man, Leo Weingart, who was one of those stuck in 1940-41 in Soviet-occupied Lvov. And he was very keen to get out. His brother, crucially, was working and living in Lausanne, in Switzerland, so he had that connection to Switzerland. So this is where the threads of the story begin to come together. And Leo Weingart was in contact with his brother on letter, and he was saying, I need to get out, and anything you can do to help me get out. It said, he heard the rumour that it's possible to get out via Lithuania. His brother, Saul Weingart, was in contact with Julius Kuhl of the Polish embassy in Bern, and made the inquiry, is it possible to find some way that people can get out via Kaunas, via Japan. And he became the recipient of one of the first, if not the first, Lados passport in the spring of 1941. So really before the Holocaust really gets going in earnest. So you can see that the origins of this actually lie with the Soviet occupation of Eastern Poland rather than the Holocaust itself, the Cuban. So that's the connection that sort of pulls all of this together. This is the first instance of a Lados passport. So he receives a Paraguayan passport produced by the Lados Group in 1941. And he actually survives that initial phase of the Holocaust. He is later murdered in Auschwitz in 1944, but the passport does enable him to survive the opening phase of the Holocaust. And of course, 1941, as a Jew of military age, bearing in mind that German invasion that would have gone through in June, July of 1941, he almost certainly would have been murdered in the first wave anyway. So this certainly enabled him to survive initially. So, how did it work? Well, a key player here is this. We can't really see the signature. I don't know what pointer there. There's the signature. Signature at the bottom of both those documents. You can see it there. Rudolf Hübli was the honorary consul for the Republic of Paraguay in Switzerland, in Bern. He was a Swiss lawyer, had been a diplomat himself, and he was considered someone who was quite biddable. Was quite corrupt is a harsh word, but he was considered someone who might be amenable to the production of illegal paperwork. He did so, as I said, not necessarily because he was corrupt, because he also had very profound Christian faith, so he believed that this was the right thing to do in the circumstances. He'd also been active already in 1938 in trying to assist Jews who were fleeing from recently annexed Austria by the Nazis. He'd been involved at that point in providing, shall we say, irregular paperwork to fleeing Jews. So he'd done that on principle. So primarily, I think he's acting on principle. At the same time, we have to recognise he is the only one of this entire operation who actually makes any money out of this. So he is charging up to about 2,000 Swiss francs, which is a lot of money for each document. Prices vary, but it was up to about 2,000 Swiss francs. So he is the only one who actually makes money out of this. And I'm sure he actually made himself an extremely rich man in the process. So there's a weird sort of combination of influences and motivations for Hübli himself. He also produced, so that on the left is not an example of one of Hübli's passports, the Lados passport. On the right is a sort of a lesser document, if you like. This is called a promesa, which is essentially just an official document on headed notepaper saying that this individual, the bearer of this document, is considered to be a citizen of Paraguay. And there were other promesas issued as well from other countries, Honduras and others, where they managed to find a biddable honorary consul to do the task for them. So that was something for people for whom perhaps they didn't have enough money, they didn't have the connections, perhaps they didn't have passport photographs that were necessary to produce a passport, so they would be issued with one of these promesas. ICE and Silberschein, as I mentioned before, provided much of the funding, very often via the aid agencies, connections to New York and elsewhere. Other funding sources, of course, also came from the Polish government in exile, particularly after 1943 in the latter phase of the operation. ICE and Silberschein also are important in that they, to some extent, were willing to curate those who were applying for these passports. So ordinary Poles, Polish Jews in the ghettos, for example, of occupied Poland, would get wind of this scheme and would write a letter, very often in code, would be written to someone like Klein Ice or to Abraham Silberschein, explaining that they wanted one of these documents, and that would then be passed into the mechanism to produce the passport. But very often, Ice and Silberschein actually, they began, first of all, with family and friends. Of course they did. That's how these things tend to work. And very gradually, that expanded beyond into the wider population. But very often also they saw very at first hand the reality of what was happening to Polish Jewry, that this was exterminatory. And very often they were trying to sort of curate, in effect, who was to survive. They were making selections. They wanted the brightest and the best for a surviving Jewish population, wherever that should be. So they were making very difficult choices, as were the Jewish councils in places like the Warsaw Ghetto, were making very often the same choices as to who should survive. So for someone like Chaim Weiss, as an Orthodox Jew, this was very often about those that were rabbis, for example, rabbinical scholars, people who were considered essential from a religious perspective. And for Silberschein, it was much more writers, journalists, those useful for Jewish society, whatever Jewish society can survive through the Holocaust. So that's an element, the idea of them creating some sort of, if you like, a Jewish arc through this Lados passport scheme, which is something I think has not really been appreciated before. So these individuals would apply, in inverted commas, send a letter in, often in code, asking for papers, enclosing their life dates, and very often what looked like a passport photograph. And very often it would say something like, this is to remind you of how I look, because I haven't seen you in so long, uncle, This is the sort of crude code that very often used to be used, because of course post would be intercepted by the Germans on a regular basis. So code had to be used in that way. Those names would then be passed on to Rokitsky. He entered them on the passports that had been purchased from Rudolf Hügli. They would then be taken back to Hügli to be stamped and signed in the regular way, as Lados explained to Pile Galage. He was right when he said they were issued in the regular way. The crucial difference is that the recipients were not Paraguayans. And apart from that, everything else was done in the regular way. So they were stamped and validated, and very often the original was then had to be notarized, so it was sent to a local lawyer, notary public in Bern, somewhere in Switzerland, who would make a notarized copy of the document, keep the original, and then the notarized copy would be sent to the recipient in, for example, the Warsaw Ghetto, the Łódź Ghetto, the Benji Ghetto, wherever it was. So, that all sounds, to our general understanding of how the Holocaust worked, rather flimsy, rather weak. But it did tend to work, bizarrely, for various reasons. The first thing is that, which we have to appreciate, and this was something I think has been not fully understood previously, is that the Holocaust is to a large extent a legalistic process for the Germans. So one of the first things that the Germans do is to rob their victims, their would-be victims, of any sort of legal status or any sort of legal representation that they had. For instance, German Jews at the point of their deportation from Germany, and very often in that early phase they are deported to places like Łódź, to the Łódź Ghetto, and elsewhere. But at the point of their deportation, at the point that they leave Germany, this was written into that particular clause of German law, at the point at which they crossed the German border, they ceased to be German citizens. They had no legal representation at all. So even if they still had a German passport, which incidentally they should have surrendered while being processed for deportation, but if by chance they still had one, it was completely worthless at that point, because they were no longer German citizens. They were citizens of nowhere, right? And the same thing applied to Polish Jews. So Polish Jews, the Polish state obviously had collapsed, if you like, with the fall of the Second Republic. Polish Jews had no identity, legal identity that they could carry with them. They had no right to legal representation. So the only documents, identity documents that Poles and Polish Jews had during the German occupation were those, Arbeitsbescheinigung, if you like, a sort of work identification, something that could be rejected by the authorities at any time. There was no identity document that was issued that actually held any legal power. So they were all effectively non-people. And what these documents did, even though, bear in mind from what I said earlier on, this is a photocopy of a false passport, effectively. So it sounds very, very flimsy, but what it does is that it puts a spanner in the works, in that English phrase. It puts a stick in the wheel of the mechanism of the Holocaust. It makes those individuals once again legal. It gives them the semblance of a legal representation. And to the German mind, this is a break on their ambition to exterminate the Jews of Europe. So that delegalization process is thereby halted. So what they tended to do was that those Jews would be pulled out of perhaps a deportation line, waiting for deportation wherever they were, to Auschwitz, to Treblinka. They would be pulled out of that line and they would be sent instead to Belsen, concentration camp at Belsen. Those of you that know something about Belsen, Belsen has a particular resonance particularly to British historiography, because it was the British that liberated Belsen alongside the Canadians, and it was particularly gruesome camp by April of 1945. Perhaps it doesn't have quite the same resonance to a Polish audience, but it certainly has a resonance with a British audience, and it is renowned as being particularly gruesome. So taking someone out of the deportation line to Auschwitz and sending them to Belsen sounds, to the British mind, like jumping out of the frying pan into the fire, but that was the choice that was given to them. And they were reclassified, those people, as what were known as exchange Jews. The German logic was these people would be kept aside, kept alive in Belsen and other places. Also, Vittel was a crucial other site, which I'll come to in a minute. But generally in Belsen, they'd be kept alive, fed, clothed, and all that, not forced to work initially. So kept in reasonably good conditions because they were being kept aside for possible exchange for German citizens abroad. And the Germans rightly made the calculation that there are many more German citizens abroad than there are exchange Jews, foreign Jews in occupied Europe. So for them, they estimated they could quite easily collect about 30,000 exchange Jews who could then be exchanged for Germans abroad. So that was the logic from a German perspective. So what goes wrong with all of this? Well, the problem, of course, the Germans are primarily responsible for all of this as the architects of the Holocaust. It's very difficult to escape the idea of an overarching German culpability, German guilt. But the problem with the collapse of this system is not really with the Germans. The Germans effectively colluded with the Lados passport operation because, as I explained, they were gathering, as they saw it, foreign Jews for exchange for Germans abroad. And they didn't really mind, and there's documents to prove this, they didn't really mind if those foreign Jews that they gathered were really foreign at all. It didn't matter. So they were just willing to have foreign Jews to exchange, and they didn't mind where they came from or who they were. Now the Germans did try and infiltrate the operation in Switzerland in 1942. They sent agents to try and infiltrate it and try and work out precisely what was going on. But the Germans were not really the problem. The problem was more in that collapse. The problem was more elsewhere. Particularly, we'll go through the culpable parties. The Swiss, for one. The Swiss, as I mentioned at the beginning, had this balancing act that they had to carry out between the Allies in the West and the demands and the requirements of their totalitarian neighbours. So as we saw with the appointment of Lados in 1940, they were very cautious to not upset the Germans too much in the hope and the expectation that thereby they wouldn't provoke an annexation or an invasion. That said, they also had some anti-Semites of their own. This is a chap called Heinrich Rothmund, who was the head of the Swiss alien police. He had been the representative of Switzerland at the Evian conference in 1938, which had wrestled, in inverted commas, wrestled with the Jewish question, what to do with Jewish refugees in the aftermath of the Anschluss. He was widely considered to be motivated primarily, or to some extent, primarily is a massive exaggeration, but motivated to some extent by anti-Semitism. And he was one of those that pushed the investigation into the Lados Group in 1943. So, as it says at the bottom, spearheaded the Swiss crackdown on the Lados Group. So that Swiss crackdown meant, because they didn't want to upset the Germans too much, the Germans are pushing them to shut the operation down. So they went initially for the members of the Lados Group, as I explained at the beginning, investigated a lot of them, tried to bring some of them before a court, failed to actually achieve a prosecution. So instead they went for the honorary consuls themselves. And someone like Hübli, for example, had his power as an honorary consul withdrawn as a result, as did the others who were issuing promesas and other documents as well. So there are other individuals involved, but it's primary paradigm we're talking about. So the honorary consuls are removed from office. So the Swiss are, to some extent, complicit in this collapse. Other culpable parties we can mention: the US State Department, perhaps surprisingly. The US State Department had a policy of not allowing, as they put it, individuals to profit from illegal behaviour. So they were objected to the Lados scheme because this was seen as illegal behaviour, the production of irregular passports for these purposes of escape from the Holocaust, By 1942-43, the State Department knows very well what's going on in the Holocaust, as does the outside world. You have, of course, the Raczynski Note of December 1942, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, whereby effectively chapter and verse, as a sort of summary of all the available intelligence around the Holocaust, is put together and presented to the Allied powers, December of 1942. So from that point onwards, it's very difficult for anyone in an official position, State Department or otherwise, to claim ignorance of the Holocaust. Yeah. It's not complete knowledge, but it's a summary of the partial knowledge that was available, and it's quite convincing that this is a genocidal process. But the US State Department had this policy of not allowing individuals to profit from what they called illegal behavior. They also viewed any possible exchange, because of course, from the perspective of the Lados Group, this is just a legal obstacle to deportation. The intention is never that those individuals should ever go to Paraguay or to Honduras or wherever it is. It was only ever that they should stop the process of deportation, and thereby those individuals might be spared. But for many of those further down the line, when this becomes a diplomatic wrestle about the recognition of those passports, this question of whether those individuals would arrive and what effect that would have looms very large. Unnecessarily so, because it was never part of the plan. But the Americans are very worried that this would become an avenue for espionage, for German espionage against the outside world. So this was part of their objection. And it was an objection that was shared by the Latin American governments themselves. The Paraguayan government particularly, and others, objected to that illegal use of their good name, as they saw it. And they feared as well an influx of refugee Jews. So they saw it as well in those terms, that we don't necessarily want thousands of Jews coming to Paraguay or to Honduras or wherever it is. Again, misunderstanding the purpose of the operation. So once those Latin American governments, encouraged by the Americans, denied or refused to recognize those passports, then those Jews held in Belsen and elsewhere by the Germans as exchange Jews ceased to have any value. As exchange Jews, while the potential was that they could be exchanged for Germans abroad, while that potential was there, they had a value to the Germans. Once that value has disappeared, they have no value at all. They're just Jews. So the tragedy of this, after, as I explained at the outset, after the operation has effectively been stopped by the Swiss, what follows is almost a 2-year process in which you have this diplomatic wrestle with particularly Polish diplomats and Polish diplomatic corps across the US and South America as well, agitating for recognition of these passports. Just a public recognition, saying we will recognize these passports. And when that recognition is not forthcoming, the Germans get wind of this. Of course, as I said, those Jews who are exchange Jews have no value, and thousands of them are then sent, consequently, to Auschwitz and murdered. Those that remained, as you can see, were kept in Belsen on the right, and Vittel camp, which is a peculiar sort of group of hotels in the centre of Vittel in France. That was actually liquidated, the Vittel camp was liquidated by the Germans in 1943 as a result of this whole recognition wrestle. And the vast majority of those that were in Vittel were sent straight to Auschwitz. Increasingly as well, Dutch Jews come into the frame. And Dutch Jews were seen by the Germans, this is where you see the Germans being complicit in this whole operation. Dutch Jews were seen as favourable, more favourable to the German mentality than the Poles, for the simple reason that Dutch Jews had not seen the same horrors that Polish Jews had seen by 1943. They were considered as clean skins. So if you could allow some of these Jews to survive, then you wanted them to be the ones that perhaps couldn't necessarily tell the whole story of the Holocaust in all its gruesome horror, whereas Polish Jews could do that Dutch Jews were much less exposed to the death camps, to the ghettos, and to the horrors of German occupation, as it was in Poland. So you have this shift, conscious shift, towards using Dutch Jews for that process. The end results. As I said at the beginning, about 10,000, the estimate was that 10,000 individuals received Irish passports. That estimate was made in January 1944. Most of those, part of that particular document says that most of those recipients were considered to still be alive in January 1944. We know that upwards of 800, it's about 839, this is from the research that's been done by the staff of the Polish Embassy in Bern, and also by the Pilecki Institute that sort of took this on as a research project in the last few years. We know that upwards of 800 are known to have survived the Holocaust with Irish passports. The estimate, using the sort of statistical analysis, is that somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 of those 10,000 recipients might have survived the Holocaust. And that's, I think, plausible on the basis of the statistical exercise. Certainly, Agudat Israel, which is one of the aid agencies, Jewish aid agencies, acknowledged at the end of the war in 1945 that many hundreds had survived thanks to the efforts of the Lados Group. It should be stressed, this is incidentally a picture of some of those, this comes from the ICE archive, the papers of Chaim Ice, which is now in Auschwitz Museum. These, we assume, are unsuccessful applicants because their papers and their identity documents or their applications and their photographs are still in ISIS papers. They didn't get processed, go through the passport process. So we assume that these are unsuccessful applicants. It's important to state at this point that a Ładoś passport did not guarantee survival. Far from it. All it did was gave you an opportunity to get out of that mechanism of deportation and mass murder. For many of those possessing a Ładoś passport, if you were taken out of that mechanism, you then had to spend upwards of 18 months in many cases in somewhere like Belsen, which was a very difficult place to survive, particularly at the very end of the war. Belsen actually has one of the highest death tolls of any German concentration camp, not including death camps, concentration camp, upwards of 50,000. And that's purely because of the conditions of the camp at the end of the war, which were horrific, endemic disease. Of course, that's where Anne Frank died as well. So, at best, perhaps you got sent to Belsen and you then had to survive 18 months in Belsen, which is no easy task. In many cases, particularly with the Dutch applicants, they apply for a Ładoś passport alongside a suite of other measures, false identity, papers for Palestine, various other measures, or just going underground. So it's difficult, assuming that those individuals then survive the Holocaust, it's difficult to pinpoint which of those measures enabled their survival. But those caveats aside, we should recognise that this is a significant rescue operation, which deserves to rank alongside others that are better known, like those of Raoul Wallenberg, for example. And of course, it is a tantalising prospect that there are many thousands, indeed tens of thousands, today, across the world, who owe their lives to a Ładoś passport. And in many cases, the vast majority of cases, have no idea about it. Because they might have known, or their grandparents might have known vaguely about this mysterious Paraguayan passport by which they were enabled to survive the Holocaust. But they never knew where it came from, they never knew the history, and that particular strand of the history has long since been forgotten. I'll just make one point on that. It sounds perhaps a bit dramatic, but I'll make one little explainer on that. I had a Twitter exchange with a chap in Britain a couple of years ago, 3 years ago now, when I was beginning this project. Daniel Finkelstein, who is a journalist, he writes for the Times, and he's in the House of Lords in London. And he would, every year around Holocaust Memorial Day, he used to do this string of tweets, linked tweets, where he told the story of his mother, who had survived Belsen. And in one of those tweets, he mentioned that his mother had this Paraguayan passport. Well, the family, his grandmother and the two children were on this Paraguayan passport. And this was just mentioned in passing. This was part of the family narrative. And this was brought to my attention. Somebody saw this and sort of linked it to me and said, do you want to have a look at this? And I got in touch with Danny via Twitter and I said, do you know anything about this Paraguayan passport? And he wrote back and said no. I said, well, we need to talk. And we met a couple of days later, we had a coffee. And he was desperate to know the details. He'd never known. It was exactly as I described. This story, the Paraguayan passport, was simply part of the family narrative. They never knew where it came from. They never knew the background. And that was the document that saved his mother's life. And I explained it to him. He's actually just published a sort of family memoir, which came out this week in London, to great acclaim, where he talks about the Lados Group. So he's actually kind of jumped me a little bit, because my book's coming out in 2 months, which I'm not entirely happy about. But it's great that the story is out there. He's preparing the way, and this is getting a lot of coverage in the British press, which is fantastic. But here's an example of exactly what I mentioned, that up until that exchange, he had no knowledge of where that came from. That his existence, indeed, is thanks to a Welsh passport. And in his case, it absolutely is, because she was exchanged as a young teenager. I think she was 12 at the end of the war. She was actually exchanged at the end of the war, January 1945, and ended up in Switzerland as an exchange Jew. So she escaped solely because of that Welsh passport. So that's exactly the sort of case that I'm talking about. So, if I may, just 2 minutes conclusion. By way of a conclusion, we should perhaps wonder, and particularly here with an audience of would-be Polish ambassadors and indeed ambassadors, how much of all of this was peculiarly or even perhaps uniquely Polish? After all, there are many other individuals, especially diplomats, who were active in providing questionable paperwork to desperate individuals during World War II. To name but a few, the Chinese consul in Vienna, Ho Fengshan, the British passport officer Thomas Kendrick, also in Vienna, or the Spanish consul in Athens, Sebastian de Radigales. All of them saved numerous lives by issuing false papers. But for all of that, it must be said also that Polish diplomats were especially active in all of this, alongside Lados and his co-conspirators. And crucially, I think, unrelated to them, we can also mention the Polish consul in Istanbul, Wojciech Rychlewicz, the consul in Marseille, Jan Małczyński, and Henryk Sławik, who was a delegate of the Polish government in exile, who operated in Budapest until his capture and murder in 1944. So in the light of that list of names, is it plausible to suggest that there's something especially Polish, perhaps, about such actions? Were Polish diplomats more motivated to help the desperate than those of other states? On this question we can only speculate, but there are a few points that are worth making in answering it. For one thing, we have to bear in mind that most of those that were helped by such individuals were Polish citizens. Rychlewicz, for example, forged naturalization papers for Polish Jewish refugees to help them evade the strict immigration quotas that were applied in Turkey and elsewhere, and issued them to Jews. Lados and his group in Bern, though they later came to supply Latin American passports to Dutch Jews as well, as I've mentioned, began their operation by attempting to assist those Polish Jews, citizens of the Polish Republic first and foremost, who were seeking a way out of the Holocaust. So is it possible there's something more going on than this purely sort of utilitarian rationale? The idea that Polish diplomats were assisting Jews for the simple reason that most of them were Polish citizens? Maybe so. For one thing, Polish diplomats certainly understood the suffering that was being endured under German occupation. They understood that perhaps better than diplomats of other nations. Not only from the knowledge that they themselves had gleaned, Lados had escaped in September 1939 himself down through Romania. He'd seen the reality of war and occupation. So not only from the experience of themselves and their fellows, but also from the details of the ongoing Holocaust that were being circulated, admittedly piecemeal, through Polish diplomatic and government circles since the previous year, 1942, and it culminated, as I mentioned before, in the Raczynski note of December 42. So that knowledge was there, both first-hand and from these official sources, in a way that perhaps you could say it wasn't for diplomats of other countries, or to a lesser extent. For another point, I think, like many Poles of that generation, those diplomats had a strong folk memory of the konspiracja, of the experience of living and resisting, in many cases, under foreign occupation. Consequently, they knew the essentials of conspiratorial methods, and they understood that higher calling that could transcend other more mundane concerns. And Lados, in this case, had a personal experience to draw on. As a young man, during the late stages of the partitions, he had been arrested by the Austrian authorities for pro-Polish agitation, and he had been sentenced to internal exile in the Tyrol, from where, borrowing the papers of a Russian friend in order to apply for a passport, he had escaped into, you guessed it, Switzerland. Unsurprisingly, we can surmise from this that perhaps Lados himself had a very undiplomatic lack of respect for official documents. Benefited from a forged passport himself in his own life. So perhaps then we can conclude that there was something particularly Polish about the response of the country's diplomats to the Holocaust, whether in the context of their simple sense of duty to their fellow citizens, or in a more complex, historically influenced willingness to break the rules for a higher purpose. As I conclude in the book, this Polish element really cannot be ignored in the story. European Jewry had few outside allies during the Holocaust, but the Polish exile government and its diplomatic representatives were undoubtedly one of them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Moorhouse. I suggest we now have a couple of questions for the audience. So, Professor, would you like to join me here?
Yes, of course.
The table. Maybe some water.
Thank you.
So, yes, I would like to open the floor for discussion. We have Director Przyłębski with a question.
Well, Professor Moorhouse, thank you a lot for this interesting lecture, for this interesting story, which is, of course, not unknown to me as an ex-ambassador to Germany. My colleague, Ambassador Kumov, was many times in Berlin, and you mentioned Bilecki Institute. There is an exhibition there. I was 2 months ago there in Berlin, and I saw it. My question would be quite concrete. You mentioned on the screen a guy from Lvov, Weingord, if I'm not wrong, had written to his brother that his passport or the paper saved his life in 41, but he died, he was murdered in 44. Do you know his story, how it happened, more or less? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that. He falls into that category, as I explained, of those who were labelled by the Germans as possible exchange Jews, and then in that later diplomatic wrestle around recognition of those passports. He was one of those, he had been in Vittel, and then the Vittel camp was liquidated, and almost all of those, as I mentioned, all of those inmates at Vittel, inmates sounds wrong because they were kept almost in a hotel, literally in a hotel. But he was one of those with his parents and sister, I believe, who were taken straight from Vittel, actually from Vittel via Drancy in Paris and then straight to Auschwitz and exterminated. So he was one of those who fell victim of this recognition wrestle, which is the sort of second phase of the operation, if you see what I mean. And incidentally, Lados himself is not a sort of passive bystander in that. So obviously he's involved in overseeing the passport forgery operation, if you like. But then once that's brought to a halt, he then is very active in pushing the MFA in London and by extension others in the diplomatic service to agitate to put on this recognition issue, to try and so he's very active in doing that as well. So he's really central to the whole operation throughout the war.
The gentleman over there.
Good morning, Professor Lados Group, Polish Foreign Minister. Sorry not to be this week, but I'm on vacation. So. But one remark, Professor, because I believe that the group of Lados has the possibility to work, because it was a big difference between one point between Lados and the rest of the diplomats from other countries. I believe that the group of Lados has at least the support, or at least from the Polish Foreign Minister in London. So this was the key factor between the difference between the Polish diplomats and between the diplomats from other countries. Because I think that the Polish Foreign Minister has the possibility to understand that this is not a war of gentlemen, but it's the clash of the civilizations. And in this moment, if we see the fate of other diplomats from other countries, we see that they were expelled from the service, they have disciplinary problems, and their career has finished because they have this understanding that the ministry, that the foreign ministry don't have. And the second more specific question: what is your evaluation of the Peruvian Consul General José Manuel Barreto, who was in Switzerland at this time, and was some kind of collaborator of the Lados Group? At least was the man who gave the Peruvian passport. Of course, he then is like usual. He has a disciplinary process in Lima. The archives still are there, and of course the career was finished. So this is my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Broadly, absolutely, you're correct. I think there's a little nuance here as well that's worth bringing in. And your comment, or your overarching comment, that a lot of the others mentioned, for example, Sugihara. I mean, he was also disciplined for doing what he did. He was told not to do it when he initially requested permission and was subsequently disciplined for it. So there are many examples like that. So in that sense, you're absolutely right. In the case of the Lados Group, in that connection to London, however, I think this is a bit more opaque than you described it. Initially, as I understand it from researching this and writing the book, initially the Lados Group had not actually informed London that this was what they were doing. There's this peculiar correspondence, I think it's in the summer of '43, it might be that late. I'm looking to Yenja and see if he's nodding. In the summer of '43, where they actually receive a message from London saying, we've heard through Jewish connections that there is this opportunity to forge Latin American or produce Latin American passports. This could be used as an exit route for refugees. Could you look into it and let us know, if you can participate in this? So London is effectively saying to Lados, why don't you do that thing? In parentheses, this is the thing that they've been doing already for 2 years by this point. So it shows you that they hadn't actually told London that this is what they were doing. Okay, and actually, by the time that they were told that this was a possibility, and then they replied to London, to the MFA in London, and said, yes, well, actually, we've been doing that. And thankfully, the MFA was very sympathetic and said, very good, started rather unrealistically, but rather started supplying lists of possible recipients and so on. Can you find this person? Like they could go and find a Jew in a German-controlled ghetto in occupied Poland. So rather unrealistic sort of in terms of their understanding of it. But crucially, I think the point is that they hadn't told London. And this could be just operational security. They could just be thinking, well, if we send this in a document or with a courier, this might be intercepted, the Germans will then clamp down and the operation will be lost. Or it could be that they didn't want to be told no. But either way, they didn't tell London. So it actually came the other way. London told them, why did you do this? And the reply was, we've been doing it already for 2 years.
If they don't tell, there's no problem.
Exactly.
The problem begins when someone tell you about this question.
Exactly.
Because London in this moment has to take some position.
Yeah. But crucially, when London, when the connection is made, London is sympathetic.
Yeah.
Which is significant. Yeah. And in terms of Pareto, there's a couple of other examples of the other. Alfonso Bauer was another one, I think, of Honduras. There's a couple of these, and I think it was very brave what they did in producing those documents. Of course, there's a financial incentive there for many of them. Actually, other than Hughley, I think a lot of them did it for free. So it's just a sort of principled thing. And a lot of them have been recognised as righteous and so on, and that's very significant and welcome. And I think it's time that that should be reopened by Yad Vashem as well for the other members of the Lados Group. It's been granted to Rokitsky, but that's something I think should be extended to the other members of the group as well. The other, obviously, the non-Jewish members.
Thank you very much.
Are there any other questions? Mr. Ambassador. Oh, there is one in the back. And then Mr. Ambassador.
Let's go in the back, yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Fabrice, Swiss Ambassador here in Poland. Thank you very much for these insights, on the works of the Lados Group. You mentioned a few times, like the dark page of history, but for all the people, interested in that, and that's the point of my comment. The Swiss government, the Swiss Parliament in 1996, created an investigative commission to deal, to shed light, on this part of Swiss history, and also in particular, on all what happened, with the refugees. And so this commission was granted unprecedented powers by the Parliament, including financial means. In the end, it was like 22 billion Swiss francs invested. The product of it is a report published in 2002, nearly 600 pages, and that part of it deals with all the policies and some of the people you mentioned in your presentation when it got to sort of this compromise. The conclusions of the report was very clear, that there was, the government, the authorities, were faulty, and that they did not, live up, to their tasks, in particular, from a humanitarian perspective. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm always wary, particularly at the moment, of judging the past and judging the characters of the past by the standards of the present. So we have to bear that in mind as well. But even that said, and I think I hope I was fair to Switzerland, because at the beginning I wanted to explain that balancing act that Switzerland was trying to do, and I can appreciate that was a very difficult situation for Switzerland to be in. At the same time, a character like Rothmund is rather questionable, I think, in his motives. So I think while we have to understand rather than damn in retrospect, I think someone like Rothmund is, as I say, rather questionable. But thank you for that, and it's very good to hear how, in the German phrase, the Vergangenheitsbewältigung is also, a theme in Swiss public life as well.
Dear Roger, if I may, of course. First of all, let me commend for the fact that you have managed to encapsulate this story with so many events and aspects in almost 60 minutes. It's very commendable. But I wanted to ask about the future. I mean, the book is already out or will be out.
Yes.
And what are the plans for the promotion in the UK and in the US?
Okay, thank you, Linda. Book is out, the UK edition is out in August, on the 10th of August. So I'm doing a few sort of history festivals and so on. There'll be media and there'll be reviews and so on. So it will be, hopefully, it will be an event in the UK. Bear in mind that there are many other books coming out, all the time. This isn't necessarily going to change the world overnight. This is the analogy I always use with these sort of things. And bear in mind as well, I have a track record in a way of tackling, how do I put this gently, but unfashionable subjects. So something like the Polish September campaign in 1939. This is one of those stories that really didn't feature in the British historiography at all. So I sort of recognised a gap there. The same thing with the Nazi-Soviet Pact, which was my previous book to that, doesn't feature in the sort of in the narrative properly in the narrative in the English-speaking world. So when you're writing about these things, you're not necessarily expecting that this is going to change overnight. It's about it's like nudging a super tanker off course. That's the analogy to use. So it's lots of little pushes, and hopefully that can begin to change the narrative. So you have to kind of make it impossible. Like now, in the example of the Polish campaign of '39, I'd like to think that I've made it impossible for someone to write about the outbreak of war in English without referencing that book. Right, properly, and talking about Poland's experience and suffering in the September campaign. And it would be nice if, nice is a horrible word, it would be pleasing if, whoever writes the next sort of big book about the Holocaust finds it impossible to not write a section on the Lados Group. Right, so these are the sort of tiny steps that we have to hope for. So it's not going to change the world overnight, but hopefully it will change the narrative gradually over years going forward. So a few festivals and so on. UK book is out in August. The US edition is out in October. It's essentially the same text, but they've done their own editing and so on. That's how it tends to work. And that the Americans always say that they're better at editing than the British. So it takes longer. So that's why they're publishing in October. So there'll be some press and some reviews around that. So as I say, we're not changing the world overnight, but it's small steps. But it's hopefully welcome small steps, and it's steps I think in the right direction.
Thank you, Professor Debek here. I just came from Israel to hear you here. I've got a question about the Lados Group in general. I mean, precisely, I'd like to ask you, why has Lados still not yet been recognized as righteous? What stood on the way? I also talked a lot with Jeff Sindler. I don't know if you recognize, he's also been very, very deeply in the topic. I've learned about Lados Group while studying in Israel, and it was a big thing for me. So I just wanted to ask you, what is on the way? What stood on the way? And also, how long will it take to get another try? Maybe?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. As I said at the end, I think it's obvious to me that the three non-Jewish members of the Lados Group should be recognised as righteous. That seems to me self-evident. I think to some extent I think there's been a misunderstanding. And this is still quite fresh history. I mean, Yenjo will testify to this. This is still something that really, upwards of 5 years ago, was really not really known. So, it's thanks to the works of Yenjo and Kumok that really it's sort of come out with into the light in the way that it has. Before that, really was confined, to the archives, and if you're lucky, to the footnotes of history. So in a sense, we have to be sensitive and sympathetic that Israeli authorities, Hashem and others, are sort of running to catch up with a developing story. So in that sense, we can cut them some slack in that respect. So I think there's hopefully the greater the understanding of the story, then that will change. I think also there's a degree to which perhaps this has fallen foul of the wider sort of Polish-Israeli diplomatic spat over the last few years. Hopefully that's coming to an end, and then we can get round to a sort of sensible, objective view on the Lados Group. But yeah, I mean, to my mind, it should be an obvious change. That should come. There is a question. I think there's a question around the criteria for recognition of righteous. I think there's this element that they have to risk their own lives in the process. That doesn't necessarily apply in this case, but there's no reason why you would say that it does apply to Rokitsky, who has been recognised, and doesn't apply to the other two. And in the same way, you can. There are other honorary consuls. I think Manuel Barreto, we mentioned him earlier on. I think he was recognised as righteous, and there's no evidence that he was risking his life in the process. So I think even those criteria are rather malleable in the application. So hopefully this is, as I say, this is just a question of the Israeli authorities running to catch up with the development story, and this recognition will follow in due course. I hope so.
Are there any other questions? If not, then I suggest we will give Professor Moorhouse a big round of applause.
Thank you.
And for those who didn't manage to pose a question during this part of our meeting, I suggest we move there and continue our discussion over a glass of wine or some food. And yeah, thank you very much once again, Professor Moorhouse.